So thank you very much, Simon. Well, I see the disadvantage of not looking enough at your notes, as I did yesterday, that I left out important bits of the argument that I need to complete it before I go on to the second part. I hope that I can compress what I have to say in an hour today. But what I left out, very, very important part of the argument, was Ricoeur's brilliant idea of a hermeneutic of suspicion. See, we're back to the situation in which I described at the end of yesterday's lecture, following Ricoeur, trying to show the impossibility of a single coherent systematic language for understanding human life. Because there are these two semantic logics, and we draw on both in our social science, in our understanding of ourselves, in our discussion of ethics, and so on. But there is a theoretical way out of this because of what Ricoeur describes as hermeneutics of suspicion. And his great examples are Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. These are hermeneutics of these, as it were, new understandings of the world that we've introduced by the second semantic logic, which show them up to be empty, to be based on an illusion, to be reflections of something else which we can understand perfectly in words coming from the first semantic logic, the semantic logic of a distant object that we find a way of describing. Now, the position of Ricoeur is not at all to say that these hermeneutics of suspicion never work. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they do reveal that this is really based on nothing. So the claim of Ricoeur is that you never can eliminate the whole gamut of such concepts, of such understandings, by hermeneutics of suspicion. They work for some, but not for all. So I want to talk briefly about that by taking some examples. If we think of certain long-standing traditional understandings of society, for instance, which definitely fall under this second semantic logic, like the understanding of society as order. The order itself is embedded in a cosmic order, so that, for instance, the different ranks, the different orders in society are ranked rightly because that reflects the actual order of things in the cosmos, and society must do that. Now, all these hierarchical understandings have been deeply undermined, set aside, or no longer considered valid in our day, and you could argue that a hermeneutic of suspicion, saying that this was simply a way of covering up various forms of domination, succeeds in undermining these. In other words, you get to the point where there isn't anything further you really need to understand. There isn't anything further which is enigmatic, which you have to find a way of describing, and you have to return to again and again in the model of what I call the antiphonal relation routine. A symbol on one hand and attempts to explain it on the other. The enigmatic object disappears, and that discourse no longer is necessary. But in order to show Ricoeur's, I think, absolutely correct perception, let's look at what replaces that, replaces those hierarchical orders. They're replaced by, if I can use this word, a social imaginary of equality, in which society is seen normatively as a combination of people who respect each other, who accept each other and recognize each other as equals, who direct their own lives democratically, that is, by participation of everyone in self-government. That is the understanding which, I mean, roughly speaking, the understanding which replaces these earlier hierarchical understandings by which we now attempt to live. I've given a very schematic, I mean, they're much more complicated and much more controversial, but that's a schematic understanding of what this social imaginary is. But this is just as much dependent on concepts and understandings which emerge through the second constitutive semantic logic. I mean, just think of equality. Starts off in the Greek world. We drew this from Greek ideas of citizens as equals. Of course, that was very restricted. Didn't include women, didn't include aliens, it didn't include slaves. But these people were understood each other in certain of these polis. They understood each other as ruling and being ruled in turn as equals. But now the point of this is that this kind of understanding was very closely linked to certain social practices. You don't just move immediately from the idea we are equals to a certain practice that realizes this. On the contrary, what you have is, in all of these cases, the emergence of certain practices modifying earlier practices, which modify practices, for instance, which give an important role to the basileus, to the king, but placing that by practices of collective rule where we recognize each other as equals, so that these concepts were just as much of the form that I was describing earlier. And this is what I think I'd like to look at for a little while today. That I tried to make this point about one class of concepts yesterday, which what we call ethical or quasi-ethical concepts, which have to do with a better, fuller, higher form of life, and whatever, however this is conceived, including ones that we might not consider really ethical because we might think they're too trivial and so on. But these kind of concepts have this feature that they, first of all, their introduction alters our practice. The thing that they're talking about is actually altered by introducing these terms. But more importantly, there's another way, another creative, if you like, activity which underlies them prior to or in conjunction with introducing these new terms, which is the development of certain practices. So when we look at certain ethical concepts, we very often see that what we have is really that the understanding of them comes first and foremost through exemplars, people who live an exemplary life, and then afterwards, and they themselves may develop the terms for the kind of virtues or whatever that they're instantiating, and that may itself be further explained. And when it's picked up by others, there also is an important role here for an important place for the practices, because people pick it up partly by understanding the new language which is used to describe these virtues, but also largely by finding the exemplar really exciting or inspiring or something that one wants to follow, and finding a way of finding, as it were, the meaning and how to apply these terms in the exemplars. Now, something similar happens in the social domain. It's slightly different the way it works out, but it has that same structure, the constitutive structure. That is, that certain practices come about. They're also then, or at the same time, understood in a certain language, and they are firmed up, maybe by being formally defined, sometimes in these cases in a certain language, and then they are continued and sometimes modified deliberately, sometimes sliding in a new direction by the continuation of the practice, the handing on of the practice to others later on, which is very often some corruptions creep in, if you want to look at it from that point of view, or some improvements creep in, or some changes creep in. So there is this continuing dialectic or exchange between the practices that are set up and the understanding of them and the way in which they're continued in history. Now, this has been very interestingly theoretically explored by a number of writers just relatively recently, who, in a way, go back to Benjamin Firth, the great French linguist whose major field was the language of Indo-Europeans, but who theorized this. Benjamin Firth had a very crucial binary, which I want to try to distinguish from other binaries. Langue discours, language discourse. This is not exactly the Saussurean binary, langue parole, right? There, the Saussurean binary is the langue is the code, and the parole is the different uses of of the code. But there, already with Saussure, you have this circulatory relationship. That is, the code is maintained only because there are acts of parole that maintain it, and that also means the code can be changed over time because acts of speech modify it in some way. But there's still not the distinction that that Benveniste introduced. Nor is it the distinction between, which we know in post-Fregean philosophy, between languages of code and then the actual speech acts, which put this language in operation and do different things. That's getting somewhat closer to it. So, but the third, the binary, I think is very important. One gets from Benveniste is language discourse. Why? Well, because he understands discourse as itself setting up certain relations. When, even trivially, when we enter into conversation over the back fence, when I say to you, we're having great weather recently, not a remark you can make perhaps in this country very often, but where I come from, people often say that, and we start talking about things. We set up we become a kind of dyad. And this, or it can be tried, I mean, it depends how many people are engaged in this. And this is, we're already set up as a kind of, as a relationship. That the things we're talking about are for us and not simply for me and for you. The phenomenon of the for us is irreducible to what is for me and for you. Even if you imagine cases where I know what you're thinking, you know what I'm thinking, I know that you know that I know that I'm thinking, etc. So, and it's being out in the open. I mean, if I'm in a terrible, embarrassing situation that my pants are falling down or something of this kind, and you're all very polite and don't mention it, don't bring it up, and don't bring it out, we can go through a kind of game where you don't mention it and I don't mention it, but I know that you know, and you know that I know, and I know that you know. But that totally changes when somebody says, you know, the emperor has no clothes, or his pants are falling down, or something of that kind. When something becomes for us, the nature of its presence for us really shifts. Now it's the creation of a for us, which is what is key to Benveniste's idea of discourse. The actual act of discourse creates something. This creation, as we know, is very important in various ways. I'll mention one, but I want to concentrate on the other. The point that it becomes a reference point for all sorts of deictic expressions. The speech event is the point of reference for the use of deictics like here, then, now, here, there, now, then, and so on, for the development of different tenses which relate events elsewhere and elsewhen to the speech event in certain ways. But I think what really is important, and this is where the work of Michael Silverstein in Chicago and one of his students, Asif Agha, has written a very interesting book. What also gets set up is the various ways that we can be related to each other, right? So I speak out of the height of my great age and wisdom, and I say to you, it's a rather foolish thing you're doing there, and we start to talk. Well, it's not only a speech event which sets up a point of reference, it's also a certain relation of power. That anyway, I'm trying on. You may resist this and try to reply to me in a way which changes the tone, and we have to fight maybe over what the tone of the conversation is going to be. But what we're doing here is creating a very rich, multi-sided relationship. It's not just relevant because the speech event is the point of reference for deictics. It's relevant because we're establishing a kind of relation. Now, this Asif Agha, I'll give these, if people want, I'll give you the references later on. There isn't a blackboard to put them on. A very interesting book. He's a Silverstein student. Very interesting book on language and social relations, in which he works this out very considerably. What particularly interests him is precisely relations of equality and inequality as they get set up in binaries, but then also become institutionalized and as it were, go beyond any particular binary to be the framework in which we, as a society, exist. So you have ways in which these relations of inequality, for instance, he's interested in these and how they get upset. These relations of inequality are established, then continued in continuing discourse, or maybe changed in discourse. One of the things he deals with is very interestingly, in a number of different societies, is modes of address. I mean, the difference between familiar and formal modes of address would be thee and you, thou and you, if we still spoke the original English of our ancestors. But in all languages that we know that surround us here, other than English, this is still, as far as I know, a very real distinction, tu and vous and so on. And how we see a move in modern world from the primacy or very important place of asymmetrical relations of this kind to the pressure for symmetry. We get a situation in the Quebec of my youth. We said vous to our parents, and they said tu to us. And that was universal in the French-speaking world 40 years ago. Now my grandchildren think that I come from the Middle Ages. Maybe they're not entirely wrong, but they find this absolutely very, very weird. So Aga points out very interesting ways in which there can be a struggle going on and people can find stratagems to force this. Very interesting case looking at Swedish. I've forgotten what do if only speak Swedish, they'll tell me what the words are. But if people who are in one of these asymmetrical situations, right, where they're saying the formal polite to the other person and being addressed, or maybe where they're still being they're addressed as vous because they've got that far that you don't allow asymmetry, but where there is a resistance against moving to the more intimate. He mentions stratagems people have. One of the ways you can do that is you say to, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that, right? And then you put the other person in a kind of quandary that either they have to reaffirm the hierarchy or they have to give in and say, okay, fine, let's call each other to, and so on. So you can see how these relations, which can later be codified as various kinds of equality and inequality, are also being inactively changed. Right? So there's not a primacy necessarily of some kind of theory or some kind of goal. There can also be simply a drift in this direction or general climate, which is what we see in the contemporary West, I think, but in other countries too. A general climate moving towards symmetry here, and then eventually pushing it to the point where the distinction would disappear altogether, as it has in English. No, I mean, it doesn't stop English speakers from inventing other ways of stressing asymmetry and being on top and being on the bottom. But you can see how the role here of actual practice is extremely important. Now, this brings us to some very interesting thoughts about what follows from these kinds of relations existing in that space, the space that, having that kind of origin, the origin that I've ascribed to the constitutive semantic logic, that the introduction of new terms and new forms is something that comes through enactment, is therefore created, is modified by the way we learn to talk about it, and then is further modified in practice, also alternating with changes in how we talk about it, by the continuing enactment. Right? So you have something where the basic semantic logic of the designative kind just doesn't apply. That is, an object appears on the horizon, an object is there, and we find a word for it and attach it. Here, once again, we have the heart of this other semantic logic. The object that those words are meant to describe or apply to is, in a sense, created along with, well, let's put it in the general point is here, that these new meanings, now they're meanings between us, meanings of equality or inequality or how we're related, they are created by enactment and then altered and further by the way we describe that enactment, so that we never have the situation of an independent object which we're describing. And you see in this new domain another facet, if you like, of the constitutive power of language. I think you can see, as we saw it in relation to ethical terms as one way in which we are constituting this new way of being through action and then talking about it, now we see how the social relations are constituted in something like the same way. And then we see further, I think it's important to work this out a little bit further, we see how there is a ritual dimension very often to these moves. For instance, there's a minimal description of ritual here and a more rich description of ritual. The minimum description of ritual is where you have a kind of self-referentiality of an expression, which helps to alter the relationship by naming it in a certain way, describing it in a certain way. For instance, in going on with this business of tu and vous and so on, in certain cultures, I think this is the case in Poland, you sometimes arrive at a point with somebody where somebody suggests, well, you take your drink and clink glasses and say, well, now we're going to address each other as thou, as tu. That's a kind of ritual which brings us over this hump, which we imagine in the Swedish case as happening by guile, and then the sort of more superior person is forced to accede to this and allow for tu on both sides. It can be done by kind of ritualized enactment, where you describe the change, and that effectuates, that brings about the change. And of course, there we have the heart of the performative, which Austin made very, very, very famous. Performative is where you have a explicit ritual. The priest says, I pronounce you man and wife, and at that moment they are, in fact, acquire this new relation. And the new relation is created by the action. But what Austin didn't see as clearly is how this kind of ritual is deeply embedded in the very nature of the language we develop for our relations. That the certain acts which create relations, including the original, have you read any good books lately, or nice weather we're having lately over the back fence, already has this powerful and active force of creating that relationship. And then we can see further how this reference to a way in which this act can be seen can enable acts of another kind. Think of various ways in which, example I want to use here is democratic nonviolent action has moved around the world by people self-consciously, Martin Luther King self-consciously taking up the Gandhian movement as a reference point. This is rather, I want to put this as something analogous to clinking glasses and saying, all of us are citoyens, right? It is a way of casting what you're doing in the light of a now understood archetype, right? That gives the understanding for what the whole meaning of your action in the light of that, right? So it has that self-referential dimension. We're kind of placing a certain description on what we're doing in order to give it the power and the meaning that it has. And then very interesting to see how this kind of thing moves around the world, so that Manila, whatever the year that Marcos was overthrown, and Tiananmen Square, and in Tiananmen Square they bring a statue of, copy of the Statue of Liberty and so on. This kind of self-description creating a certain meaning of the action is from another similar action is what is going on all the time. And then we see how movements for democracy, like Tahrir Square and also the Gezi Square, demonstrations in Turkey last year, or was it this year? I mean, not very long ago, have something like the same feature, that what happens is that when people got together in Tahrir Square, they got together on the basis of, here we all are, all Egyptians together from all backgrounds, and we have what we want together is to be really citizens, that is to have power, not be disempowered and treated as simply as objects. What they're doing at that point is trying to enact citizenship. Right? They're self-consciously trying to enact citizenship, and the symbols they use and the way they relate to each other are meant to be doing that. And we see the same kind of thing in the Gezi Square demonstrations in Istanbul, and even the attempt to enact that in certain social forms, whirling dervishes and so on, but also having a fast-breaking meal, right? Even including people who are never practicing Muslims who go together at this fast-breaking meal, because that's a way of, if you like, showing and therefore creating a certain kind of solidarity by reference to this other kind of event, which has another kind of cultural meaning. So we can see here very rich place for ritual. And just one more reference here. The Rossan Vallon, interestingly, if you go back, this is the French historian of democracy. He's written some absolutely brilliant work on democratic development and equality in both France and America and the UK as well, and so on. Already in his first very early book, Le Sacre du Citoyen, right? A piece about the French Revolution as having this very important ritual dimension in which people were consciously people coming up and voting, attempting to enact equality of citizenship. And he comes back with a recent book saying that that is what is really something that we find continuing need for in our society. Michael Sandel, very interesting in his What Money Can't Buy, makes the powerful point that being able to imagine ourselves as equal citizens participating in the same collective act of decision gets deeply undermined by certain kinds of social difference, vast differences in wealth, leading to quite important differential access to certain common events. So Sandel makes the point that the sense of being equal citizens together was greatly aided by baseball. Everybody is there from different classes in the same game and all cheering the Dodgers. But what you have today, of course, is that very rich people get themselves places in a skybox way above the stadium, right? And they can look down on it and they get a much better vision of the entire game. And the rest of the people are down here. And he talks about the skyboxification of American democracy. Anyway, so there you have, now, I want to move on from this because I want to talk about another very important issue, but you can see the very rich possible way of understanding issues like equality, democracy, and so on in terms of this constant interplay between practice and self-understanding, and how certain practices we can slide away from certain practices that keep this self-understanding alive. I mean, that's what Michael Sandel is talking about with skyboxification, that there are certain practices which nourish the understanding that people have that they exist alongside other citizens in their society as equal participants. When you get, in an extreme case, a lot of people living in gated communities and a lot of other people living in ghettos, it becomes impossible for that imaginary of equality to survive, right? So you get kinds of development like, the Mitt Romney's 47% concept, right? Which really wipes out a sense of being co-citizens with all those other people, which leads to legislation, by Republican, yeah, at least legislation where certain right-wing groups try to stop people from going to the polls and so on and so on. So you can see how this kind of understanding of the society and the way in which it's lived are related in such a way that we're really dealing constantly with this other kind of semantic logic. But I wanted to talk about today, I wanted to talk about trying to apply all this to our understanding of morals and ethics, and try to see, first of all, how some of the features I tried to claim are central here are understood and actually misunderstood in various important philosophical traditions. Now I want to start off with what I was talking about yesterday, about the way in which our access to certain ethical ideas and standards is through what I want to call felt intuitions, that there is a sense that we have when we think about them or ask ourselves if we really adhere to them, a sense that we have of something very important here, very moving here, or on the contrary, in the case of their opposites, a sense of repulsion. If you want to, there isn't a dispassionate access to these. Getting to know them, getting to understand them is partly being moved by them in a certain way, essentially has as part of it, being moved by them in a certain way. Now, how is this played out in the mainstream philosophical traditions, and how ought it to be played out in a proper philosophy of ethics? Well, first of all, we think of Hume. See, Hume, following Hutcheson, really takes that point about it has to move you, right? And he says, it can't be reason, he thinks, right? Because what really moves you to action is not just reason, but had this felt sense of, yeah, this is something right. So he's taken this idea from Hutcheson, the theory of moral sentiments of Hutcheson, but he's removed it from, I know that John and I have had lots of arguments while you maybe we'll have it again, but he removes it from where Hutcheson put it, which is a providential understanding. Right? God has made us so that we react in this way to good and bad action, because he sees what is for our good, and he's, as it were, implanted in us these reactions. He takes it entirely out of that providential framework, and we get the possibility of a purely, if you like, naturalistic theory of sentiments, of approval and disapproval, which we just happen to have. Reason then enters in a secondary capacity as what allows us to calculate, if you like, instrumental reason allows us to calculate what kinds of things will have the consequences that we can really approve of. And so that's one way of moving in this particular area, taking account of this very important role of the felt intuition, in the case of Hume, but ending up, as everyone knows, in really utilitarianism. Bentham was very inspired by Hume. So we get an ethic where the issue of what is good and what is bad is decided by counting reactions, how people react positively and negatively, how it produces happiness or unhappiness. But there's another reaction to all this, which is much more negative in regard to felt intuitions, which is the one that we see emanating really from Kant and all these reapplications of Kant and Habermas and Tim Scanlon and so on, where what we hope for is a way of bypassing the arguments about ethics that I was suggesting, and I'll go into again today in more detail. That is where we try either to change the intuitions of our interlocutor and get them to see, to feel what we feel, or we have more powerful indirect arguments where we say this particular way of understanding human motivation makes more sense of human life than that other one, which are, by the nature of the type of discussion, always I mean, never totally conclusive. You never totally come to the point where you say this is the final interpretation. Right? So that scares people off. It can't be rational. Ethics can't be rational if it depends on that kind of thing. So we retreat to morals in the way that's now been, that distinction is now defined. Morality concerning what we owe to each other, if I can take the title of Scanlon's book, and ethics concerning what is the good life, right? And the idea is, well, you can hive off ethics as a domain in which, yeah, intuitions do reign, and in the end, maybe you can't prove that this is wrong and that's right, but let's contain them by making them secondary judgments that have to, as it were, incline to bow before the judgments made in the name of morality, what we owe to each other. This is the Habermas solution. The good life is something we can differentially like and accept in different cultures, but we ought to have a framework of rules of how we treat each other, and these come from reason. And you get attempts of philosophers like Korsgaard to prove it as part of reason on the grounds that there's something inconsistent in my claiming something for myself and not according it to others. And this seems to me to be a really unfounded. When you try to press these arguments, I could take a lot of time doing that, but I think maybe we have limited time. It's better to spend it by looking at what happens when you go beyond this kind of argument. But it seems to me that they're very, very weak, and they fail even a certain phenomenological or hermeneutical test. That when you think of, and what these arguments try to prove, is that I can't be in favor of my own welfare without being in favor of everyone else's. Whereas, when you see how these intuitions of the universal human, the universal claim of the human, arise in history through the great changes of the axial age, and they're received by all of us not as a logical consequence of our self-love, but as some kind of transcending of it. You know, when you read in Christ is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, man or woman, you can't help. You feel, oh, this is something that's lifting me up above the way I normally operate and normally want to operate, where the people close to me are the ones that, or me, only just me is what matters. And what you have here is something like a very powerful felt intuition, which can also become part of culture so that it becomes, in a certain sense, unchallengeable, or you can only challenge it if you do very weird things, like talking about master races or Ayn Rand and so on. I mean, you have to do very, very weird and very implausible things to break them, to break open, as it were, the human universal and say only this part of it counts. And that's where the appearance of self-contradiction arises. But in fact, what it relies on is this kind of powerful felt intuition that we have got, in our case, from our religious tradition, and has now become universal. Well, now, what does this mean for our understanding of what morals and ethics are as a whole? And I'd like to make the following argument. As against this view that morals can be hived off from ethics, you understand what I'm making with this distinction. The issues about how we treat each other can be hived off from issues of what a good human life is and treated by a certain kind of logic, and the others can be treated by just letting intuitions go and so on. As against that, I think you could show that this kind of division can't be made. For one thing, our morality, our rules for how we treat each other, really rely on certain understandings of the good life. When I say your freedom ought to be respected, and, well, in Alberta, if you know Canada, you'll understand why this happened there. Somebody made a case before the courts that he didn't have to be forced to wear a seatbelt because that was infringing his liberty. He won in the first instance in Alberta, and he overturned by the appeal court. But what we all feel is ridiculous. I mean, it's, of course, if somebody says, my right to practice my religion, my right to state my opinion in public has been infringed, and this is against the Canadian Charter, we all agree. I mean, people will say, well, we didn't mean to do that, or they will try to pretend that the act had another meaning. So what this shows us is that there are implicit judgments about the trivial and the important, which lie behind the actual application of a rule like respect people's freedom. Everyone should be, their freedom should be equally respected. And go beyond that. I mean, these are things that are being filled in, you know, without mentioning them, they're being filled in by our general intuitions and making it look as though these rules are kind of self-applying, but they aren't self-applying if ever they're challenged in this way. Moreover, in another way, you can't really get rid of the ethical when you think of what it involves really properly to put into action some of these requirements. So there's the expression, for instance, equal concern and respect, which we find occurring a lot. I mean, Ronnie Dworkin made a lot of this in his derivation of democratic ethic and so on. What does that mean? Well, the attempt is to convince us that this can be cashed out, if you like, in terms of actions forbidden or enjoined, which are, let me put it this way, can be described externally, simply by what operation in the world they bring about. So, and certainly, up to a point, they can. Certainly, respecting your freedom or treating you equally with respect and so on. I can't kill you, I can't maim you, I can't put you in jail and so on. There are all sorts of things of that kind which can be characterized without trying to get into the ethical manner in which these are carried out. In other words, to recur to the basic theme of these lectures, these acts can be defined as the acts they are by a use of language where the semantic logic is the first kind, right? We see people killing each other, we see people maiming each other, we see people putting people behind bars, and we give name to that, and we say that is ruled out. But there are all sorts of cases where it's terribly important, the manner is terribly important, that you not be treated as though you're dirt when you come into the office to get your whatever it is, that people listen to you in various contexts, where virtues like sensitivity, generosity, openness, right? And now we're talking about virtues, you see, that can only be, that we never could have introduced into our lives without some basis in praxis, which we then can modify by the way we describe it, that belong, in other words, to the second semantic logic, where concepts of this kind are operative. So I think we can see that the idea of a self-sufficient morality, without reference to virtues, without reference to ethics, just won't work. I mean, it's not operative. It's not something you can carry out. You have to supplement, without allowing it, you have to supplement it constantly, this stripped down morality where the actions that are enjoined or forbidden are all characterized, let's say, externally. You have to supplement that with this kind of ethical understanding. So the package involved in a proper morality / ethics includes both. But it also includes more. That is, it includes some understanding of motivations, some understanding, first of all, of the motivations that are impediments to behaving properly in this moral, ethical / ethical understanding of how to behave. What stops people doing that? Sometimes very simplistic ideas are put forward about it being simply egoism. People are concerned only with themselves. They can't transcend that. But obviously lots more things are going on. In some cases, you have people who get a sense of their own goodness by projecting evil on others, right, and thinking they themselves are not in any way part of this. I mean, Dostoevsky's Possessed is a sort of wonderful novel, precisely about that. You know, the scientific figures say no one is to blame at all, and you know, the wise figure says we are all to blame. This sense that we're all in this together, that we're not simply us who are good and you who are evil, the evil empire and that sort of thing. Now, that can be the source of immense wrongdoing, the invading Iraq and so on. It can be the source of a lot of terrible wrongdoing, and it's not something that is simply classifiable as egoism. It's something to do with a false kind of spirituality. And we could go on and on and on with examples of the kinds of things that are stopping us from doing what in another part of our minds we usually recognize as the right thing morally and ethically. So we need some understanding of the impediments. And then fourthly, we need some understanding of the source, what I call in the sources of the self, moral sources, what it is, the turning towards which empowers us, inspires us, strengthens us to do the good, what Plato saw in the idea of the good, what many of us believers see in God, in our relation to God, in our contemplation of the incarnation and the self-giving of God. But you can go on the whole, I mean, other people see in the forces of nature and so on. There are all these forces these sources that we try to connect to in order to be empowered to live a good life. So we have a actually very complex understanding. Theory is maybe too formalized a way of putting it. The understanding we have of morality / ethics, the one that is operative in our lives, the one that allows us actually to do what we're supposed to do and understand what it is we're supposed to do, has at least these 4 components and is very, very complex. Now, what is it to argue for one of these against another? What I tried to say yesterday, one way the argument can succeed, I mean, I can convince you, for instance, you can convince me. One way is the, in a sense, internal way, that I say something, you say something, maybe rhetorically, which triggers off in me some sense, yeah, that's a truer, that's a more adequate understanding of what's really good here, and it's ratified by a felt intuition on my part. But that doesn't always happen. So what are the other recourses of reason? Well, they're actually legion here, and we haven't time to go into them in detail, but I think you can see them, that somebody comes at us with a certain view of things, a view on life, of what's stopping us from being what we really ought to be. Right? And of course, what kind of thinking of the New Testament is full of this. I mean, the way in which the understanding is totally turned around. The Pharisee and the publican I'm biblically challenged, and for this audience I tremble, but that's somewhere in Luke. But obviously you see here you're being invited completely to change your understanding of what is going on here. Or it's John 8, the woman caught in adultery, where some magnificent statement, let him who is without sin. And you can see people suddenly are able to grasp who is without sin. Because the whole thing is predicated on the sin of a woman, and we're great, we're great and noble and right-thinking people. So how do you move people if they don't get moved by that, right? Which very often you find yourself reading the New Testament. You get seized in a way, and you can see it right away. It kind of makes that reorganization in your sense of the good. Well, because this whole package of morality, how we treat each other, of the ethics, of the impediments, of the sources, also is a kind of palette of motivations through which you can attempt to read, hermeneutically read various passages of history. I mean, your life, your friend's life, your political society's life, what happened in the French Revolution. I mean, whatever. You can see as you move out into different passages of human life and history, or in your own life or in that of others, you can see things that we're always struggling to understand hermeneutically what exactly is going on here. And a very important question that's always at stake in that kind of hermeneutical discussion is whether our understanding of the motivations that can possibly impinge and how they relate to each other really illuminates this situation or not. I mean, an example about the French Revolution, think of François Furet's critique of the earlier, very Marxisant understanding of the French Revolution, right, in which what you have here, the terror is seen as a consequence of the crisis in which the Republic was in, attacked by the Vendée on one side and the coalition, the Duke of Brunswick on the other side, and so naturally it's quite understandable that they got carried away and executed a lot of people. And Furet said, well, first of all, I mean, he tried to show that the actual dating of these events didn't fit. I mean, that was after the coalition was seen off. But more particularly, he said, look at this incredible language about corruption and purity and so on, this fantastic invasion of this almost pre-modern language. I mean, the language of sin is stain and so on, recurring here. And people getting carried away with this and really tremendously excited. How do you explain that, right? Oh, superstructure. But no, just a minute, sit down. Why do people get into that kind of situation, into that kind of encasement? And so he tries to give his Tocquevillian, we may not accept that, but what I'm trying to show you is the way in which a great deal of our attempted understanding of human life and history involves this kind of argument, right? You have a reading, and I have a reading, right? My reading is better than your reading because I want to point out to you certain features of the situation for which your reading has no place. You can't give a sense of this. You can't explain why this is happening. My reading can, right? Now, that is, I think, extremely important part of ethical argument in the most general sense. But I mean, not in the sense that we're sitting down necessarily arguing about ethics and talking about the French Revolution, but in the sense that if each one of us looks at their own take on morality and ethics, we will find that it's sustained not only by what I call the internal route, by our felt intuitions, it's also sustained because we can make sense of a great deal of what's happening around us and earlier on in these terms that other rival views can't do. Right? There is therefore a kind of hermeneutic conflict of interpretations that's always underlying our arguments about ethics and morals. So we have here a very complex picture, but note that the struggle for interpretation here about looking at these different understandings of motivation and impediments and sources, the conflict here is exactly the kind that we saw with Jücker's symbol and thought, the symbole dans la pensée, the symbol in philosophical thought, namely that we can have different interpretations, that different interpretations are prima facie justified because the thing doesn't, the meaning doesn't stand out on it right away in a way that can't be denied. Only an idiot will fail to see. There really is something enigmatic here. We can, in spite of the fact that there is this enigmatic condition, we can make arguments of the form, this view is better than that view, right? So there's a point arguing. But we can never make arguments of the form, this view is the final, ultimate, unimprovable, totally unsurpassable reading, because it's only in the light of another possible reading that we could say this was better than that or not better than that. So we get this triple situation that I described yesterday relating to Ricoeur's idea of the split language, that the enigmatic symbol, different views. We can show that some views are better than others, but we never can say, this is it, end of story, end of debate. Exactly that predicament becomes our predicament. And when we look at this kind of discussion in the light of the difference of semantic logics that we've been looking at, we see that the whole difficulty here, the whole difference from a lot of other debates arises from the dual semantic logic at stake here. We have here a different situation from the Ricoeur situation I described yesterday with symbol and thinking about it, where I described the relation as antiphonal, right? You move from the symbol to an interpretation of it, and then you question that, and you go back to the symbol, another interpretation, and you question that, and so on. It's not antiphonal anymore, but it's what he calls a discours mixte, a mixed discourse. Why? Because you can see involved in this kind of debate the two semantic logics are operating. When I'm coming from the outside as an historian and reading about the events of the French Revolution, they're there before me, they're named already some way, I'm figuring out what the best account is, I am operating with the first semantic, that is the designative semantic logic. But I can't totally get over that because you don't really understand the social meanings that are operative there unless you have some access via the second semantic logic. Either primary access that you're a practitioner of that, or there's a secondary access which we developed through admirable skills of ethnography, of going somewhere and getting or reading a lot about it and getting a sense of what moved these people, how it worked for them, and so on, where in a secondary way you can get a sense of what these meanings were as they were embodied in practice. And you understand them as embodied in that practice and a constant interchange between practice and description. So both semantic logics, or as it were, results of both semantic logics have to be operative in this discours mixte. It's partly a discourse of distance description and partly an understanding of what it means to live that kind of thing. So you never can reduce it all to one language, but it's not the simple antiphonal model of symbol, explication, look at it again, another explication. This antiphonal model, as I argued yesterday, is very, very common in our thinking, like the work of art, the work of literature, and the criticism of it, work of literature and criticism of it. But in this case, we have, in this case of critical understanding of history and critical defense of our own morality, we have a discourse which is really mixed. We're not moving from symbol to explication and back and forth. We have all together in the same discourse an operation of both semantic logics. But we forget, to our to disastrous consequences, if we don't recognize that the two logics are operating, if we give ourselves the belief that we don't need the constitutive semantic logic at all anymore, either because we have, in our hermeneutic of suspicion, wiped out all that stuff, or because it can all be reduced to neurophysiological, whatever, Dan Dennett-wise. But, these are crazy pipe dreams, and they're crazy pipe dreams precisely because the great, exhibit number 1, 2, and 3 of a successful hermeneutic of suspicion, like the destruction of hierarchical views of society and the cosmos, had to be replaced by something else, other practices and their naming and developing, which were also partook of this second semantic logic. The second semantic logic can be knocked off for certain modalities of it, but it can't be knocked off altogether without a totally different human predicament. I mean, where discourse doesn't do anything, doesn't set up anything, and so on. And we've got to the point where we're unimaginably on the limit of what it is to be human. So what I've tried to do in all this is is, I mean, today and yesterday, what I tried to do is start off with the brilliant work of Ricoeur and try to say how his work, the Temps et Récit, La Métaphore vive, and others, Conflits et Interprétations, has pushed philosophical and also theologically understood anthropology in a new direction. And I've tried to work out what that direction is, what's involved in that direction, by bringing up this theory of different semantic logics. And this theory is one that obviously I owe totally to the HHH, to Hermann Herder Humboldt, and which goes against the logic of the other theory which so much dominates modern analytic philosophy. And so I hope this marriage of Ricoeur and the 1790s has produced something which doesn't seem totally wild and incoherent. So thank you very much for your wonderful attention.